Good morning, everybody. Today is December 10. This is the office hours meeting for Cluster API provider Azure. We follow the CNCF meeting standards, so please be nice to everybody and raise your hand if you need to ask a question. Let's get started. I don't see any new items. Oh, here's one item coming, but I think we did a release since our last meeting, right? Maybe you can say something about that.
Yes, actually, yeah, good point. So we released 0410 last week, and has a bunch of cool features like GPU clusters and private clusters, etc. And yeah, we hadn't released in a while, so it's a bigger release-ish. But yeah, take a look. Let us know if you have any issues. Feel free to reach out in Slack or on GitHub. And I think this will be, we'll have one last release or one last bigger feature release for V1 Alpha 3. And then that will have multi-tenancy and such. And then we'll probably move on to V1 Alpha 4 after that. Does that sound good?
Yes. They mentioned in the Cluster API meeting yesterday that they were about to do like a tag at least or something for the V Alpha 4 because the providers are asking for it. I guess once that happens, we can start getting ready for doing the types in V Alpha 4.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we'll be able to use the nightly build. That will be great.
Okay, so let's go through the open discussion items. Windows PR status, that's the first one. Was that James or you, Cecile?
Yeah, I kind of added those, sorry. Just wanted to, well, if James is okay talking, because I know he was driving earlier, but just wanted to see, you know, what's left to do in the Windows PR and where we're at.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I been working on getting the VHDs published. All the tests are passing locally when I run it against that image that I've built. And so I think so I published 119.3, but our tests run on 119.4, so I published that last night, so it should be available this morning, so I'll rerun the tests. Beyond that, I think the open question was just around the additional Windows tests. Because Windows is using Flannel instead of Calico, I had to add extra set of clusters to run those tests. So I know that's not ideal, but it's that's where we're at right now with the Windows support. I did look into adding Calico support, but it's going to be a little bit more extra work, and just didn't want to delay Windows much longer. So anybody have any thoughts on any of
that? So a while back, we added a end-to-end test full suite for GPU clusters because we didn't want to run GPU clusters at every PR because they're pretty costly and they were slowing down everything else. So wondering, like, I don't want to exclude Windows from PR tests. We should definitely have some Windows, like some Windows cluster, but maybe we should rebalance what we're doing with the Linux clusters, like maybe move some of them to the full suite so that we don't run them on every PR and they're optional. Not sure what people think. I don't know how long. We should also look at how long the tests are taking now with the new tests, or with the new clusters versus how long they were taking before.
Ideally, I'd like us to have
just go ahead, James.
Sorry, it was Craig. I was just going to say I would like to see at least some Windows tests in the PR tests.
I would suggest, like, if we can mix in one test, like we create a cluster with a mix with Linux and Windows machines.
Yeah, so that's what I had suggested on the PR. And
Okay.
James pointed out that because Windows tests are using, or because Windows clusters need flannel, they are different from the Linux clusters because we're using Calico, but I think it would be okay with using flannel in some of the tests. Go ahead, David.
What do we, so the test might be taking a little bit of a long time. Perhaps we just have 2 PR jobs for the time being, one for Windows, one for Linux, and just run them parallel.
Yeah, I like this idea. I think it's a good idea to have them isolated. And we can also look, as Cecile suggested, into removing one of like the next ones if they're taking too long. Move it to the full.
Yeah, so I added a Windows for machine pool and a one for VMs as well. And so maybe we only need one of those for the Windows side.
Even though if they're running in parallel, then it's probably safe to have 2. I think it's good to have more Windows tests right now just to make sure we're not breaking it, because we might not be paying attention to some of the things it needs. So just in case, it's probably safer to have a couple of the Windows tests at the beginning at least.
Are we actually running these tests in parallel at this point? Like, are we sure that we are?
Yeah.
Okay.
We weren't before. We thought we were. Now we are. But we only have a limit on the number of nodes that we can use, like Ginkgo nodes. So we're not necessarily running, like if we have seven tests, we're not going to run all 7 in parallel. I think it's 3. So it will still take longer.
Okay, I think we're kind of in agreement. Does anybody have any more questions or comments for James?
I just want to say great work. Awesome. This has been a long-term project, and it's coming to fruition, and it's really exciting to see it. Thank you, James.
Yeah,
Seconded.
thanks. And if you have any comments on the PR, just let me know and I'll see if I can resolve them.
Yeah, it's exciting to have Windows. Can somebody volunteer to help with like creating the different job? I guess that happens after the PR is done, or do we need to prepare the job to have the Windows tests now?
So we should create the jobs now and have them set as run, like don't run by default and optional, so that they can be used to test the PR itself, and they can be like triggered just on that PR. And then once the PR merges, we can switch them to be run on every PR.
Okay.
Do we have a specific script to run that? I'm asking because I didn't check the PR.
I think it's the same end-to-end script, but we'd probably add like a Ginkgo
just pass
focus.
the Ginkgo
Focus, yeah.
focus.
Yeah, on
Okay.
Windows.
I can take care of that if no one wants to do that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, sorry, go ahead, James.
I mean, I'm happy to make those jobs. I didn't hear if somebody else said that.
I think Carlos said he would help with creating the jobs.
Okay, cool. Let me know if you have any questions.
Okay. Okay, so the next item is VMSS sync reconcile. Is that David or Cecile? Sounds like David.
I mean, I added it. But I want to hear David talk about it.
Bus drivers coming through. All right, cool. Thanks, Cecile. So I would love to talk about VMSS and async reconciliation. A little background. I'm pretty sure most of the folks on this call know that the reconcilers go through and they make a call to Azure, and they make several calls to Azure usually. And then we build resources if they don't exist. We get to that goal state. And part of building a resource in Azure is that when we do a create, a put, or a patch to create an Azure resource, oftentimes those trigger what we refer to as long-running operations. And a long-running operation returns you a successful initial response from the HTTP layer, and you get a 202 accepted or 201 created, and then that starts kicking off the Azure service, the Azure backend, into actually creating that resource, provisioning the infrastructure, and doing what it needs to get it into a ready state. Part of that is that once we get that first successful response, that triggers in the Azure SDK a polling back and forth with Azure. So it's going to constantly be getting that resource, asking it if it's reached a terminal state. Once it reaches a terminal state, either successful or failure, we end up, the SDK returns back that object. For us, as a consumer of the SDK, it looks dangerously simple. Like we call create and then it waits and gets it back, which is not actually the case. It functions that way, but for us, that creates a really long loop in our reconcilers. So for example, in a VM, it's going to take 70 seconds or something like that to complete a reconcile loop for a machine. That's bad UX, right? So that's going to cause our users to wait to see any kind of like status updates on a object for like 70 seconds. So I feel like that is unacceptable and that we should do better. And one way we can do better is kick off these operations and track them. So we reconcile quickly, pushing towards a goal state. And we do this asynchronously. I have a PR open for machine pool, where a machine pool will go and start reconciliation and create, like, say the machine pool doesn't exist. It creates it, starts creating the VMSS behind the scenes. It doesn't wait for the VMSS to finish completion. It takes a future from the Azure SDK and it stores that on the status for the machine pool. The machine pool then comes back and the machine pool reconciler then says, hey, call me back in 15 seconds. And it comes back and reconciles again. It sees that there's a future on the machine pool. It rehydrates that future, passes it into the Azure SDK, and the Azure SDK goes and makes a request and checks to see if it's done yet. And if it responds back with, hey, I'm not done, then it says, hey, call me back again. So this is not it's not very different from what the SDK does under the covers, but for us, it actually gives us the ability to respond to users. So it makes our concurrency levels can be a little bit lower, but be much more responsive to users of our controller. So this is really desirable behavior. Where we go from there is eventually, once that operation is complete in Azure, we can then say, yes, it's created, mark the terminal state on the K8's resource, and move on with our day. All the while, we've been updating status, we've been updating conditions, we've been producing events, and we've been very responsive to our users. This is going into machine pool, but I think it also sets a pattern. And this pattern can be used for all resources. There is one thing that we do need to watch out for here, though, is that control flow has had the expectation that all resources before it have been built. So some resources depend on other resources, and this can get a little bit difficult if in fact you go to build resources that were waiting, that expected other resources to be built before them, but are not quite done yet. So the way I've structured the code is that it returns back a not done error. And our reconcilers are all structured in that we return errors quickly upward. So if you run into an error, usually we wrap it and set it up. This causes us to stop reconciliation right there and continue from there when we come back. So this might be a little bit odd with the errors, but I'm curious what folks think. It seems to make sense in the way that we're handling it. It's a little bit chatty in the logs right now, and I would like to make sure that these transient errors, these transient states, don't dirty up the logs. So we probably quiet those down. But I think it's more, hey, how should we do it? Should we add another return var, or should we create a return struct? Or are we okay doing this with errors? Should we do it a different way? I think one way or another, we need to get to async reconciliation. It's a step in that direction. Thoughts?
My only concern is that all these errors in the log sometimes confuse people trying to look for something. So either quiet these down, but we still kind of need to know. So not sure.
Well, we know what type the error is. So what we do is at the top level, we say, is this a not completed error? And if it is a not completed error, we shouldn't log it. Like, we're just not done yet. So
Yeah, or just log it with a very low verb or very high verbose number, so that it only shows if you really want to see it.
Yeah, seems reasonable to me. Cecile, did you have any comments?
No, I think the whole thing is really great. I already looked at the PR, and I had like a few questions around, well, like, yeah, the errors, how does it work if another resource gets created after that expects the resource before it to be created? And David answered that here. And then the other question I had was, how does it affect the number of API calls? Because I know that's something that can be quite, sensitive with big clusters and lots of resources. And my wrong impression was that if you call the SDK to create a resource and then you wait for it to be completed, that's just one API call. But I was wrong. It turns out, as David explained, that you call it once and then you have to pull it constantly to know if it's done. So it's actually more than that. So it's not like we're increasing the number of API calls by doing an async reconcile. We might actually decrease it because we're doing it more smartly now, where we can control like how long we expect the resource to take and not requeue until we think there's a good chance that it's created. For example, there's no point in checking, like right now, there's no point in checking that a VM is created after 10 seconds. Maybe in the future, but right now it's not there. So yeah, I think it's really great work.
Okay, thank you, David. And everybody, please take a look at the PR and put any comments you have there.
Thanks, y'all.
So this is the last item. I didn't add this. I was just going to mention that I pushed a bunch of changes to the multi-tenancy PR, all the things we talked about, except the only one thing that is not done yet is the allowed namespaces, because I don't know how to do it yet. But anyway, I'm still going to work on like whatever comments and stuff that come up. So, and I'm doing some more testing right now as hopefully somebody takes a look at it.
I am midway through a review. It looks really good so far.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, feel free to add whatever comments and anything missing you see, and then I'll work on it as I try to figure out or also feel free to tell me or suggest the allowed namespaces thing, because I keep getting, even though we talked about it, I keep getting confused about it.
So maybe it would be good to talk through that a little bit with the group and maybe get some points of view, because I would love to hear, I would love to get a sanity check on it. like, does it make sense? Should we continue down this path? Do you want me to kind of phrase it up, or would you like to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so multi-tenancy. Basically, we are looking to have an identity decorated on the cluster that the cluster will use to provision infrastructure in Azure. So what this gives is the user the ability to have an identity that's separated from the environment variables that we've instantiated onto the controller, and so that cluster can be built by whatever identity the user says. So this really leads to two main scenarios. One scenario is that the user is not terribly concerned with security. They will put their identity in the same namespace as their cluster. And we have an object reference. Nader has in the PR object reference to an identity. And it's a Core v1 object reference. And that identity is assumed to be in the same namespace in the easy case. And the identity has a reference to a secret, and we use that to build the AAD pod identity binding that binds the controller and the identity together, and we can use that to provision the cluster. The more advanced use case is that, say we have a user and a security organization, and the security organization would like to create identities, but only house them in the security namespace. So it's like their high security namespace. Normal users don't have access to it. Only the security organization and our controller have access to this namespace. So a user within, bank like foo, the user is told there is a identity that you can use to provision your cluster. Here is the name and the namespace for this identity. We have provisioned it for you. You can use it. The user comes in and creates their cluster in namespace called A. So alpha, the alpha namespace, and they create in the alpha namespace. The identity in the security namespace has allowed namespaces on it. And the allowed namespaces is a label selector. That label selector has both alpha and beta on the label selector. The namespace where by virtue of using the alpha namespace, our controller is then able to reconcile that cluster using the identity provided by the security org, because the cluster was created in the alpha namespace. Now, if that cluster was created in the delta namespace instead of alpha, then if someone tried to create a cluster in the delta namespace and use that same reference to that identity, the identity would not be allowed to be used because it does not have delta on the basis. It only has alpha and beta. So those are the two scenarios. One is trying to, the secure org is trying to make it where identities aren't available to users. They're available to a cluster, and they're scoped to where the namespace, where the cluster is built. So if the cluster is built in a given namespace, allowed namespaces constrains that. So that's the thought on it. Anybody have any ideas, feedback, concerns?
Is there a diagram of all of that somewhere?
Not yet.
There should be, and maybe that's what I'm doing this afternoon.
Yeah, I think for me, I need to kind of visualize that a little bit. So there'll still be a single controller that can create clusters from various namespaces, and the label selector that enables them to use a particular identity. And so so the single controller can have multiple identities, or now they're going to be creating a controller for a certain identity and for a different identity for a different part of the company.
Single controller that can use multiple identities.
What's the default on allowed namespaces if it's not defined? Or is it required to be defined?
And if you don't put anything, then you can use any namespace.
Okay.
It's open. Like the default is whatever.
So if
I guess.
let's,
Sorry, go ahead.
let's say you're in scenario 1 where you create your identity in the same namespace as your cluster, and you don't specify allowed namespaces because you're not in that use case. That means anyone can create a cluster in another namespace using that identity.
Yes. You can choose when you're creating the identity object or resource. If you put that restriction on it, that's the only thing that will restrict this identity from being used. If you leave it open, then you're saying anybody can use this identity.
This is one of the things that I find very weird about Kubernetes in general, is the idea that the controller doesn't know the user that's trying to make the operation, right? So in a lot of places, you know the RBAC rights to a user, and we don't know the user that's actually manipulating the object. So we have to constrain it by other things, and the label selectors is how we constrain it. So if you want to secure this object, you put it in a namespace that only a few people have access to, and say, hey, you can only use this from these namespaces.
Would you then put like that label on the cluster when you're creating the cluster for it to match, or?
What label do you mean?
If it's like the names, the label.
So the allowed
Because
namespaces?
Yeah, it's on the identity, but it's like the labels, the label selector is like a match labels. Then would you need to put that label also on the cluster? No.
I don't believe so.
Okay.
That's,
Yeah.
Perhaps we could do something like that. Like we could match labels on a cluster and that's the identity. But because we're using an identity reference, it's not really label based. I'm not sure. Maybe that's an improvement on the design.
Okay. No, I'll look at how to do that. I haven't done that part yet. But does anybody have questions or concerns about this approach? Cecile?
Not really concerned, but I think we should, whatever we do, make sure that we're in talk with the other providers to make sure that there isn't like super big discrepancies in the user experience. Like even if the underlying implementation isn't the same, at least so that the user experience is somewhat consistent. Like for example, I know Kappa was talking about whether they should have the like credentials part of the infrastructure components and have multiple ones, or if it should be a prerequisite that you create your credential secret, which I think we're going for the latter. So we should make sure that we're talking to them about it and, explaining why.
A couple of weeks ago, I explained everything I'm doing to Nadir just to get his feedback. So I think he's aware of what we're doing, but I can touch base with him.
Okay, great.
Yeah, a lot of the original design was cribbed from what Kappa had done, Nadir and folks, yeah.
Okay. That was the last item. Does anybody have any other questions or comments they want to bring up?
Do you want to take a quick look at the milestone?
Yeah, sure. Milestones. How do I get to milestones?
Oh, actually, yeah, I have one thing, PSA. There's an issue with Kubernetes 1.17.14 in the Azure Cloud Provider, the in-tree Azure Cloud Provider. So don't use it. It should be fixed in 1.17.15, which is currently being published.
Perfect. Here's the milestone kernels here. Okay, so multi-tenancy, that is the one I'm working on and we're talking about. I think it's pretty close. David is reviewing, so hopefully it's pretty close. Machine pool, CAPZ version upgrade doesn't work.
I think David sort of wanted to work on that and was, yeah.
Yeah, part of it is getting the async stuff in place so that we can start putting in rolling updates, max search, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so that's okay. Support client certificate authentication, that's part of the same PR. That's like kind of fixed by using a pod identity. So once we have multi-tenancy, that's kind of taken care of. So I added a part in the documentation about it, and both of them should be fixed by the same PR. Next one, test of experimental. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Just a quick one. So for the CAPZ version upgrade, Seal, you got the PR into CAPI for fixing token refresh. Is this associated to token refresh? And should we wait to get the new version?
It's associated in the sense that, like, if you're trying to do an upgrade after 15 minutes, it's not going to work, but we can still work on the mechanism of the upgrade, and the test will run within 15 minutes, so it should be fine. But yeah, the token refresh is part of the 0.3 release branch, so it should be part of the 0.3.12 release, which we're cutting on Monday. Fantastic.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and reword the title a little bit, just to kind of scope it to the mechanics of update.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. So next one, experimental retry join. I think I have a PR for that. That's just we have to keep running. We at least need to wait for the next CAPI release 3.12 and then decide after that. So I think we're okay if that's not merged. We're just testing with it. So we'll decide based on what happens. Windows 1 is in progress. Document the different Azure identities. That's the only one that's not assigned to anybody.
It's number 3 on my list here.
I think it makes sense to have the multi-tenancy merge first, since that's going to affect how Azure identities work. But also, we should probably first and foremost update the multi-tenancy proposal to match what we're doing now. Is that number 1?
That should be number 1, David.
Yeah.
And then I can take that one once like I'm done with like the actual PR. I didn't want to do it until we were done. So if you haven't gotten to it at that point, I'll take it.
Sounds good. And I think, so Craig might have some good feedback on that because he's been playing with the quick start, and I think he has some like feedback on how we can make it clear, because I think some of it was a little bit confusing.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a strong opinion on how it should go, but I'll be a very good error tester or confusion tester.
So what? Go ahead, David.
Has anybody gone through the Kappa quick start?
Not in a while.
I haven't. It's on my backlog though.
So I would invite you to go through the Kappa quick start, and just the way that they set up like roles and set up the initial CloudFormation stack is kind of, it's interesting. They use their own command line to help provision some of the resources that you need to get started with init. honestly, I think we need kind of a training wheels before you actually call in it, and maybe something that handles the service principal provisioning or any of the other stuff that we need to get started before you actually do it. Just my 2 cents.
Are you thinking maybe an AZ command line plugin?
Craig, that's a brilliant idea.
I think it was your idea, if I remember correctly.
I think we talked before about adding like some kind of CLI, but like nothing happened with it. Okay, but anyway, whoever works on this, make sure to mention Craig in the PR so he can take a look and review it. And then the last one is move cluster describer methods to CRD types. I thought there was a PR.
Yeah, there is a PR. It
that.
must not be linked to the issue, but there's conflicts. It's in need of rebase. Yeah, I guess that's part of it. It's not the whole thing.
Okay. So that's the status of the milestone as is right now. It's probably enough. We don't want to add anything unless there's like some critical bugs or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not in here, but I think Matt Boersma was working on using the new NVIDIA operator since they released support for containerd. So I don't know if we want to put that in there. We don't have to. It's not.
Well, when are you expecting to do this? In January at some point?
Yeah, I
before?
mean before that, I think. I'm not sure. Matt's not here, but I think he started to work on it.
Okay. No, I was gonna say, I mean, if he's already working on it and it's ready, we can just add it, but we don't have to wait for it if you want the release to come out.
Oh yeah, we're not gonna block the release on it or anything, but yeah.
But keep in mind that we won't be able. If you're saying this is the last like 0.4 release, then we'll probably won't be able to do like another quick release unless there's like bug fixes, because we'll be working on the 0.5. So
yeah,
if we want this to be there, we can wait for it. I don't think there's a big, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I think we should just, what do people think in terms of the release timeline for the next release? Should we do that before the holidays or do it when we get back?
I feel before the holidays is like too close to the one we just did, but David, go ahead.
I agree with you. And also from a timeline perspective, the amount of work going into prep a release and then go through all that stuff, it's probably a little tight on time to get the PRs that we want to get in.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's just aim for January for the next release, and then we can get that in there as well. Because I think we definitely want to make sure multi-tenancy and Windows make it in, and we don't want to rush those. So,
do you want me to add this to the release? Change the release. Is it?
Yes, please.
Is this the one?
Or to the milestone.
Oh, I mean to the milestone. Is this the right issue?
Yeah, actually, yeah. And then if you can assign Matt Boersma. And if there's a change of plans, we can always remove it.
Okay. How do you do the milestone?
I'll change the due date for the milestone as well, so it sets realistic expectations.
Yeah, we just released like a week ago, so, and we need the copy release as well, so you can't do it before we get that and test it and all that. So. Okay, any other issues or discussion points?
Since we're on the topic of releases, I just want to give Carlos a big CAPZ. Way to go, Carlos.
What?
Nice job getting CAPZ out.
Oh, thank you.
Nicely done, man.
Yeah,
you saved it. You saved CAPZ from dying.
I was looking around to say, this is not sounds correct, because I was trying to make it work. and that's okay. Maybe need some love here, and then I took like almost 2 weeks to putting like the tests and everything back in place.
Yeah,
But I think worth the effort.
good job.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll finish a few minutes early. Okay, everybody enjoy your vacations, whoever's taking vacations, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays.
Happy
Happy
holidays,
holidays.
everybody.
Happy holidays.
Bye all. Bye.
Bye.